Hello. So this week, there are a couple things. You're going to move through chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. So this is going to be a little more reading. Neither of the works in 3 or 4, the classical works, I think are overly difficult. So it takes a lot of processing. These, I think, may take less, so that might help. You also have your first art discussions. Now, the art discussions, I want you to follow a certain format. So look in the syllabus for my example of an art discussion. You can also go to the link provided to look at the artwork so you know what I'm talking about. But I want you to follow that format in the syllabus fairly closely. So don't be overly brief. If you're overly brief, you don't provide enough details, then you're not going to do as well on it. Make sure you get the museum card bits of information, the artist's name, the title of the work, which should be underlined or italicized, the medium of the work, so oil on canvas, tempera on canvas or tempera on panel, and the date of the work. All of that stuff should be provided on the website, or I will provide it in the email that I'll send you. But that stuff should be there. So make sure you get that, and then do your description and discussion as I do in the example. Now, chapter 3 is about Zeus and Hera, but it's mainly about Zeus. And the classical work that is excerpted is the Prometheus Bound. Prometheus Bound is a play, a tragedy, traditionally credited to Aeschylus. There are some people, I would be one of them, who don't feel this is by Aeschylus, but by some other playwright who, may have got credit at one point, but it ended up somehow being ascribed to Aeschylus, and that stuck. So we have no way of knowing for sure who the author is, but it's a very dark play. Zeus, who does not appear in the play, comes across as a tyrant. And Prometheus is presented as a savior figure, the one who has taught humans all they know and taught them basically how to survive and develop. Now, one key thing here is this is a tragedy. That means it was written by an Athenian for an Athenian audience. So when Zeus is presented as a tyrant, now, by the way, a tyrant is not necessarily a bad thing for the Greeks. A tyrant is a king who didn't become king because he was the son of a king, right? The kings, right, is descent by bloodline, right? So is how it works, right? The eldest son of a king becomes the next king. A tyrant is someone who takes kingly powers but does not have a birthright to it. But tyrants could be good. There were tyrants who actually did great things. Hieron of Syracuse is a famous tyrant who was actually, he had a long reign. He seems to have done very well for Syracuse. Syracuse seemed to have profited under his reign. So, not that he was perfect, but, he was no worse than a king. But Athens became a democracy because the last two tyrants they had were very bad. They were cruel and they were terrible rulers, and people were killed and tortured and everything else by these guys. And they were overthrown, and then a democracy was established in 508 in Athens. So for an Athenian audience in the 5th century, there would be people in the audience who would remember those guys, who would remember those tyrants and remember them being overthrown. And so the way Zeus is presented in this play, indirectly by what people say about him, he's basically like those bad guys. So that's a rather radical thing to do, right? You're going to do a play where Zeus basically comes across as some real cruel, right? It'd be like if you were to do a play about God and you were basically to make, the guy that comes out looks like Adolf Hitler. I'd be like, whoa, what the? Right. That would be the same sort of effect, I think, of this play. So keep that in mind when you read the selection. Now, the scholarship in Chapter 2 is by a woman named Wendy Doniger. She wrote a book called The Implied Spider, and it deals with comparative myth. Doniger is a Sanskrit scholar, is a scholar of Eastern religion and scripture, and she's arguing for comparative myth. Now, Malinowski argued that you could only understand a myth within the culture that it came from. It otherwise is basically just nonsense. So comparative myth for him probably doesn't have much value. But Donner just says there are certain things that happen to everyone, right? Everyone's going to experience death. So, and everyone's going to experience the death of someone dear to them, in their lifetime. It's something they're going to have to deal with. The separation, marriage, becoming a parent, all of those things are fairly universal things. And so you could have some universal guidelines to look at myth from. And that's sort of her argument. So it doesn't really contradict, but it provides a sort of like a different way of looking at myth than Malinowski. And she's a very good writer, so it's a pleasure to read her writing. Okay, the comparison section 3.3 tells the flood narrative in Genesis, so the Noah and the flood story. Now the Greeks had their own flood story, featured a guy named Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, and Pyrrha was the son of Pandora and Epimetheus. The interesting thing about the Greek account is the Greek account deals with the problem of incest. In the Noah story, if only Noah and his family survive, right? So there's Noah, Mrs. Noah, he has 3 sons, and they're all married. That's a very small genetic pool from which to then repopulate the earth. In the case of Deucalion and Pyrrha, they are told to take the bones of their mother and throw them over their shoulders, and they figure out that means the rocks, because it's Mother Earth and the rocks are her bones, so they throw the rocks, and when the rocks hit the ground, they turn into people. Well, there you get the genetic problem solved, because none of the rocks are related to one another, so you start off with a wide pool and a fresh start. So, not that that's addressed in the story, but I find that sort of an interesting, sort of sidelight. At any rate, you can look at that. There were flood narratives throughout the Mediterranean, and flood is not a problem generally in the Mediterranean, at least not in the Eastern Mediterranean, because the climate is often very dry. So, what that's all about, was there a flood? I think the evidence is that there was not a worldwide flood, right? That the Noah story is actually what it seems to be, a myth, just like the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The modern piece, the Nachleben section, deals with the story of Leda and the Swan in 2 versions, one by William Butler Yeats, W.B. Yeats, and the other by Hilda Doolittle, known as H.D. So the story of Leda and the Swan is as follows. Leda is the daughter of Tyndareus, the king of Sparta. She's very beautiful. Zeus sees her. Zeus wants to have her. And Zeus disguises himself as a beautiful swan, which Leda starts to pet. And then, depending on the version, either attacks Leda, because after all, he's the king of the gods, so she can't really resist him, or seduces her. So it's a more mutual thing. Which version you take, sort of determines how you look at that story. So the 2 versions that we have here, William Butler Yeats views it as a violent attack and sees the Trojan War, because Leda, one of her children, is Helen. Helen, of course, is taken away to Troy. That starts the Trojan War. So sees in this violent act violence that later happens at Troy. This is an interesting idea. H.D., Hilda Doolittle, who was a cosmopolitan woman of the early 20th century, an American, she sees it more as a seduction. She sees it more as mutual, and the description of the mating of the Swan and Leda is presented in rather lush terms. It's not violent terms, but it's actually sort of very seductive terms. So, again, 2 ways of looking at that account. Then we've got the beginning of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with Hades and with Demeter. It primarily deals with Demeter, but there is some stuff about Hades. And one thing I just want to say quickly about Hades is we do not get in Homer the sense of the underworld that's presented in the book. In Homer, the world of the dead is a gray world that everyone goes to. And it is just sad because what matters most is to be alive. And so when you're dead, you're finished with life. So no one basically is punished in the underworld, or very few people are punished in the underworld, but everyone lives this gray existence. Later, you get this personal evaluation, like a judgment, and then you're either punished or rewarded in the afterlife, which is similar to what I think if you grew up Christian or Catholic within the Christian group, you probably heard a lot about like heaven and hell and that sort of thing, and then you get a judgment which determines whether you go to purgatory, get rid of your sins, and then go to heaven, or whether you go to hell where you're not going to get freed from that. It's a permanent sentence. So the Greeks don't have that yet. They do get that with some later authors, and the Romans got it too. But the ancient Greeks and the Romans both had wildly different views of the afterlife. Some believed that there was no afterlife. Some believed that you went to this gray place. Some believed that your soul survived, but it became part of the sun, and so therefore you've lost all individuality. And some believed that there was individual judgment, and then you were rewarded or punished accordingly, or that there was reincarnation where you get another chance. So there were lots of, it was all over the map. But with regard to Homeric hymn number 2, Homeric hymn number 2 to Demeter, I just want to say this. It tells the story of Hades kidnapping Persephone. Hades and Zeus had agreed to make Persephone Hades' wife. When Persephone is kidnapped, her mother Demeter, who is the goddess of the earth and goddess of agriculture, she is grieving, and ultimately she goes on strike. Things don't grow, and Zeus has to tell Hades he has to let Persephone go. Persephone, while she was there, ate some pomegranate seeds, and because she ate something in the underworld, she has to spend some of her time in the underworld. This eating of pomegranate seeds seems to be code for they had sex. So by becoming part of a couple with Hades, Persephone is no longer just Demeter's daughter. She's now Hades' wife. That's sort of the takeaway. And it's an etiological myth that explains the seasons. Spring is when Persephone comes back and the earth laughs and Demeter is happy. And then the fall and winter are the months where she goes back to Hades, and then things are dead or appear dead, but then they come back. So the cycle of death and rebirth is part of that story. The scholarship in chapter 4 moves to a different take here, and this is, what's the purpose of myth? Is the purpose of myth to reinforce social norms? Is it to challenge social norms? So Malinowski would argue it's definitely to reinforce social norms, right? The importance of myth is as charters to explain certain behavior, and then those are the behaviors you're supposed to do. So Helene Foley is the author. She looks at Homeric hymn number 2, and she claims that Homeric hymn number 2, which seems to challenge social norms on some levels, is ultimately about reinforcing social norms, and especially the social norm of marriage, which was ancient marriage was basically arranged between the husband and the husband-to-be and his father-in-law. They're the ones who arranged the marriage. The daughter and the mother might have some input, but they don't have any ultimate say or authority. That's dad's decision. And we get like the harshest case of that in Homeric hymn number 2, where Hades and Zeus have made this deal, but they didn't tell either Demeter. They didn't even tell them. It's not a matter of like whether they consulted. They didn't even tell them. So Persephone is kidnapped. She's not expecting it. She sees it as an act of violence, and her mother sees it the same way, because that wasn't the deal. She only finds out that it was arranged later. And even though that would not be the norm, I mean, I don't imagine most dads didn't keep their daughters and wives in the loop on this marriage thing. It just seems like having them on board is going to make the whole thing smoother, and it just seems to me keeping them out of the loop is going to cause problems. And so I think that realistically they were generally consulted, but this poem could make the case, yeah, maybe you're consulted, maybe you're not, but it doesn't matter. Dad gets to make the final decision on your husband, and that's it. So that's the material for the week. There's a lot of stuff you can comment on, so you should be able to easily make 3 posts. Again, I would recommend in doing the discussions, I would recommend you do the following: the bulletin board discussions. I would recommend that you read for a certain period of time and try to do a little bit every day if you can. I mean, I know people's schedules don't always allow that, but if you can allow yourself a half an hour or to an hour just on one day, you can make a post on what you read. So you read for a half hour, you can make a post. You read for an hour, you can make a post. And the thing is, you do that 3 times, you get your portion of the bulletin board done. Then you only have to read some other students and comment on theirs, and boom, that's done, and you get 100%. So you want to do that as much as possible, and if you get your at least 2 posts in, by Thursday, then you get an extra credit point for each, so that can help put some extra credit points in the bank in case you need them down the road. So that's just my advice. I think if you try to do it all at once, like say, I'm going to take 5 hours on Saturday or 5 hours, on Sunday, and I'm just going to barrel through, what's going to happen is you're not going to remember enough about any part to really talk much about it. So that's why breaking it up, I think, helps you get it down better. That would be my argument. That would be how I would do it. It is how I do it. It's how I read the material for this class. And it's also, I'm in a bunch of book clubs. It's how I read the books. I don't read a book cover to cover ever. I've got an hour today, boom, I read that. And then I make sure I take notes, and then I remember what I've read. And I find that works for me. If it doesn't work for you, that's fine. But years ago, I tended to read things cover to cover, and oftentimes I couldn't remember the beginning of what I read when I got to the end. So you can take the advice or not. So I will see you next time, and good luck in getting the stuff done.